Okay, I want to welcome all of the attendees to our first fall 2020 Neuroscience seminar in the series. If you go to the Brain Institute website, you will see the full calendar for the seminar series posted there for all of our future meetings. Today we're inviting a guest speaker that's been brought into us by Dr. Ceylan Izgor. So I'm going to go ahead and throw it to Dr. Izgor in a minute so that she can introduce her speaker. I want to remind everybody that because we're online, we're not going to open it up till questions until the end after the speaker is done with his talk, so that there's not constant interruption while we're going. And at that time, we'll unmute your microphone if you wish to ask a question. And all you have to do is activate your raise the hand button that you see on your Zoom screen. Okay? All right. Well, Dr. Izgor, please introduce your speaker.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Mehl-Madrona. I'm going to take a couple of minutes. He's currently joining us from Arizona on a trip, so thank you so much for making the time. Louis is from indigenous Lakota tribe from Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota, his father's side, and Eastern Cherokee from his mother's side. There's some Greek and Swedish in there too, right? So that we talked about that today. Stories were a way of life growing up indigenous for Louis as he grew up hearing them from his elders. He attended undergraduate college in Indiana University, Bloomington, Indiana. He had profound experiences there in early 70s, working in a lab with rats, conducting experiments, tested if serotonin was indeed a neurotransmitter. Randy would like to know about that. He studied hippocampal theta rhythms under the influence of serotonin. He spent quite a lot of time with Sir John Eccles, the Nobel Prize winner in neurophysiology, on very stimulating subjects such as how does the soul interface with the brain. After graduating, he was accepted in Stanford Medical School. During his time in Stanford ambulatory medicine clinic, he often sat down and told stories to the patients, and it seemed to help people. One day he was asked by a colleague, where did you learn hypnosis? At the time in 70s, Stanford was popular with hypnosis work. So Louis started studying hypnosis, deep states, learning, and memory. After his medical degree, he received his Ph.D. in clinical psychology. He's currently a faculty member in Eastern Maine Medical Center with specialty in family medicine and psychiatry. He is the executive director of Coyote Institute in Maine. His interest is in understanding mechanisms of how stories can be used in healing, understanding alternate connectivity of the brain, the default mode or story network, where the brain can be retrained to function more efficiently. His passion is essentially uncovering transformative power of story in healing and building bridges between conventional medicine and indigenous wisdom. He is the author of many books, well-known, such as Coyote Trilogy, Narrative Medicine, Remapping Your Mind, The Neuroscience of Self-Transformation Through Story, which is also the title of his talk today. His work emphasizes moving towards individual patient preference medicine with all its complexities, multidimensionality, and everyday reality. So I'm going to turn over to Louis for the seminar.
Great, thank you. And now for the ultimate test, we're going to see if I am capable of sharing my screen. We've practiced this though, so we think it's going to work. All right, can you see it? Okay, so here are some ways to get a hold of me afterwards if you have questions or interests. And my idea today is to spend the first third of the time talking about narrative medicine itself, and the second third talking about the neuroscience of story, and the final third talking about clinical applications. And I'm aware that some of you know a lot more neuroscience than I do, so I hope you'll forgive me in advance if I'm behind the times, but I struggle to keep current, so we'll see how I do. And, you know, my only disclosure is that someday I might get a royalty check if you buy my book. I'm not holding my breath, but it could happen. That's the book that this lecture is based upon. Here's another book that is related to the lecture as well. So, and you're also going to be exposed to some of my amateur photography in the corners of the slides. So that's one of my pastimes, is taking photos. So the question that I hear frequently is, why do stories matter? And Gottschall thinks that we're defined as human beings by our need for stories, and that stories give us identity, they give context to our histories, and they organize the experiences of our lives. And stories literally tell us who we are. You know, they educate and inform us about what is the good life, what are our values, how should we treat each other, who are our enemies and how should we treat them. Everything we know from a story. And one of the organizers of the narrative movement in psychology was Jerome Bruner, who taught at the University of California, Santa Cruz, whose sports mascot is the banana slug, by the way. Go Slugs. You can imagine their cheerleaders in yellow banana outfits, you know, rooting for the slugs. So Bruner said that, you know, narrative stories, in other words, organize the whole of human experience. And not just the life stories of the past, but all of one's life as it unfolds. In other words, we really are a story under construction, that we're a story in process, we're a novel being written. And one of the beauties of the life story interview, which we'll talk about later, which comes out of Northwestern University, is the idea of people considering, so what are your next chapters? What's going to happen next? And how do you get there from here? So so Bruner is one of the figures that is important. But beyond that, we use stories to create a social identity, to tell us who we are in connection with other people, and within our particular cultural grouping. So also stories tell us what matters, what's significant. And so now if we move into medicine, as early as 2000, Glenn Roberts talked about how impersonal case histories compound our patients' suffering by not illuminating each individual's experience in the struggle to survive illness. And you know, that's only gotten worse in terms of the electronic health record. And especially, we just got a new electronic health record where I work, and the new one is so hard to enter personal history about people that no one does it. So, you know, the old, or at least in our old electronic health record, I could write a free text story and it would continue to populate each time I created a new note. But not in the new one. It tells just enough for the Center for Medicare Services to pay us the maximal amount and no more. And no one's willing to take the time to update the social history. And even if they try to, there's no free text. You can't write anything in. It's all check boxes. So we can't tell good stories anymore about our patients. And that's a shame. So Kleinman, as early as 1988, predicted that if we don't make the person's story part of their healthcare, that their humanity will be stripped away and will fail to recognize what is unique to our patient's experience of his or her illness. And on another front, there is a philosopher by the name of Kay Toombs at Baylor University in Houston. And she wrote an amazing book about the phenomenology of illness based upon her own experience of having multiple sclerosis. And I highly recommend it as an example of medical phenomenology. Kleinman, by the way, gets credit for introducing the term illness narrative and healing narrative. And the illness narrative is the story that the patient tells about why they're sick, which can be very different from the doctor's story about why they're sick. And the healing narrative is the story the patient tells about how they think they can get well, which can also be very different from the story the doctor tells about if they can get well and how they can get well. And Kleinman's point is that if the doctor's story is too far removed from the illness narrative and the healing narrative, then nothing good can come of the interaction. And we'll experience what we call non-compliance or non-adherence. So, and to me, non-compliance just means that your story about what's helpful is so far removed from their story that nothing is going to happen. So Hunter talked about how doctors actually spend their whole day telling stories. And if any of you have spent time behind the scenes in medicine, if you sat in the precepting room, when the medical students and the residents come in to present their cases, you know that most of the time we don't have a clue what's going on, that we make up a lot of stuff. We make our best guesses, and then we try to convince patients that we're right. And we try to put in like ways that if we're wrong, they'll call us and tell us, oh, I'm getting worse. What you gave me isn't working. Because we're almost never certain of what we're doing, but we pretend really well to know what we're doing. And we have to tell stories to convince people that we're positively sure that this is what ails you. And here, do this, and that's going to make you well. I remember when I was a medical student, we were like, well, you can treat everything with prednisone. So just give them prednisone, give them steroids. So Hunter also thought that the loss of stories and the telling of stories makes it really hard to care for chronic patients and incurable patients. So where is all of this in relation to evidence-based medicine? And it's been a number of years now that narrative medicine has been on the retreat, that it's being called unreliable, it's being called anecdotal medicine, it's considered unscientific, and many journals have stopped publishing case reports or case series. They only want to publish double-blinded randomized controlled trials. And I think that's a terrible shame because we lose the individuality of illness, and we lose the opportunity to make sense of the results of randomized controlled trials. So, and we lose, you know, the existential qualities of medicine, you know, people's inner hurt, their despair, their hope, their grief, their moral wounds, their moral pain. We lose that shared experience of their suffering, you know, which can be hard to share, but which makes us better doctors and better health practitioners. And by the way, this is what an osteopath looks like after graduation from medical school. So, when in doubt, talk to a rock. So, you know, everywhere, all over the world, healers are telling stories. And I read a marvelous paper about a folk healer in Bangalore telling stories to her patients, one after the other. And when I've sat with North American indigenous elders, you know, telling stories to people, you know, it's just rich. And the stories communicate to people how to get better, what to expect, you know, how to heal. And, you know, they're really the glue that bind people together, the sort of basic irreducible unit of meaning in human life. So, so it's through stories, through these stories, we learn how to change. We learn how to be more richly connected to our spirituality. We learn how to have faith through interacting with other people. We learn the hidden assumptions about life that are implicit in the stories that our families tell. And we learn how to change and grow. And so I want to invite you to think about the stories that you tell. And the best way, I think, to appreciate this is to go to a wedding. So at a wedding, you have two families who generally don't know each other, telling the stories, telling each family's stories to the other family. And the goal is, you know, each family is trying to indoctrinate the other family into their families. So let's see, I'm getting a message that there's people in the waiting room. So I'm going to refer that to Linda to let people into the waiting room. So imagine the stories that you heard at the last wedding you were at, or imagine the stories that you heard at the last funeral you attended. You know, funerals are about everyone agreeing on the stories we'll use to remember someone. And, you know, there's formulas that are used at weddings. At weddings, everyone has to explain Weird Uncle Fred. You know, and everyone has a weird Uncle Fred. And everyone has to tell an embarrassing story about the bride and the groom, you know, to the other family. It's like inevitable. And it's part of creating bonds between the two families. At a funeral, we have to erase the bad stories that we carry about the person who died. And we all try and figure out, you know, what are the really good stories that we want to tell about this person? Or think about a really moving, a powerful film that you've recently seen. And the stories that you tell your friends about that movie, you know, and what it meant to you. And I want to tell you a little example from my practice about the power of story. And it's a story about a young woman who came to see me when I was practicing in Tucson. And she was a character in a country music song. She had fallen in love with a cowboy and had left her life in Brooklyn and had moved to the country outside of Tucson to live with this guy on his ranch. She didn't know how to drive because you don't have to drive in Brooklyn. In fact, it's probably a liability to know how to drive in Brooklyn. She was, a nice Jewish girl who walked to temple. Well, you can't really walk to temple in Tucson. You need a car or a horse maybe, but it's a long ride on a horse. So anyway, the relationship fell apart. And she was just beside herself with sadness and depression. And I sat there listening to her tale of woe, and I was beside myself with sadness and depression. And I thought, oh my God, this is terrible. This is awful. What am I going to do? I was throwing up my hands. And when that happens to me, I have a few stock questions I ask people. And so one of them is, seen any good movies lately? Sometimes that works. And to my amazement, her whole countenance brightened and she said, yeah, Whale Rider, that was great. And by the way, if you haven't seen Whale Rider, go rent it. It's on Netflix, it's on all kinds of media. And it's a movie about a young Maori woman, it's set in New Zealand, who wants to learn how to be a healer. And her grandfather doesn't want to teach her because she's a girl and girls don't learn to be healers. And her mother has died and her father has sort of left her with the grandparents and moved to Germany to recover from his grief. And there she is. So her grandfather is teaching these young men stick fighting, Maori stick fighting, and he won't let her learn. And so she bribes her brother into teaching her by buying him beer. That's his medium of exchange. And so she keeps bringing him beer and getting him to teach her stick fighting. And she becomes so good that she can win the contest over all of the boys that her grandfather has taught, which embarrasses him to no end. And I won't give away the rest of the movie because it's something else to see. It's incredible. So I said to this woman sitting in my office, I said, so if you were a kata, what would you do to get out of this terrible funk? And she said, I would learn stick fighting. And I said, well, why don't you learn stick fighting? And she said, well, how? And, this was in the days before the internet or the instant internet. And so we had this archaic object called a book. And it was the directory of everything weird in Tucson. And so I looked up stick fighting. And it turned out there were no Maori stick fighters, but there was a Filipino stick fighter. And I called him up because in those days we had phones. We didn't text everyone. And he answered the phone and I explained the situation to him. And he said that he'd never taught a woman before. And I said, well, is there anything that would keep you from teaching her? He said, no, I don't see why not. He said, fine. So I put her on the phone and they talked and she figured out how to get to the next class. And I didn't see her for 3 months. And I thought, I better call her. Maybe she's dead. Maybe she killed herself. because she was so sad. And so I called her up and I said, hey, I don't mean to bother you, but, you left me hanging. I need narrative closure. Like, what happened to you? And she said, stick fighting happened to me. She said, I'm not depressed anymore. She said, I moved into town. I can get around to everywhere I want to go. I'm actually learning how to drive, of all things. And I never thought I would learn how to drive. And I go to stick fighting class. And she said, it's great. She says, I'm not afraid of men anymore because, if they cause trouble, I can beat them up. Probably I could even kill them. And she said, and the really great thing is all of these guys in the class, they want to date me because apparently they're attracted to women who can beat them up. She said, I said, wonderful. So, it was a one session cure. And to me, it's the power of story because she enacted a story that she connected with which she had identified with the main character. And she became that character and ran with it and completely transformed. So I have a note to tell you more stories, but I'm going to run out of time if I do. So I'm going to skip creation stories and glue scap stories, but I just want you to become aware that each of us has a creation story. And I want to invite you to reflect upon your creation story. Maybe your parents were on vacation, in the Berkshires, or maybe they were on a fishing boat going to Cuba, or maybe, my parents met at a USO dance. My father was in the military. And in those days, this was during the Korean War when I was conceived, they paid local women to come to USO-sponsored dances and dance with the soldiers, the airmen, the sailors. And I guess my parents did more than just dance. So here I am. So that's my creation story, the short version. I never told that when my mother was alive. Hey, Mom, are you listening? Probably she is. But, it's okay to embarrass dead people because they have a really much more improved sense of the glory and the power of life and the meaning of life. So, so we have creation stories. And I'm going to skip the Hopi creation story because in some talks I use it as an example of, how cultures have creation stories and illnesses have creation stories. And these stories teach us to understand the forces that led to the illness and the conditions of the illness. And they're powerful. So this is how we elicit an illness narrative. I might ask you, and by the way, I want to invite Linda to make available the slides to anyone who wants them. They can be converted to a PDF, and you can play with them at your leisure. But if I want to get the illness narrative, I would ask someone, tell me the story of a time when you got sick and how it happened. What was going on in your life at the time? What was happening in your relationships? What were you finding unpleasant or disagreeable? What else was happening around you at this time in your life? Did you give your sickness a name? Did you have a different view of what created your illness than your healthcare practitioners? And so on. And that begins to get us to the illness story. And the illness story gets us to the metaphor of the illness. And I just want to take a moment. By the way, this is this is winter, in case you're wondering in Florida what it looks like. I know some of you have never seen it, but I want to share a short passage from a book called Wild Dogs to just expose you to the power of metaphor. This is by Helen Humphreys. She says, "The wild dogs roamed the summer fields just outside of town. Their eyes flash, bright stars in the woods at night, and they weave like fire through the dry grass towards the edge of the city, looking for something to kill and eat. Love is like those wild dogs. If it hunts you down, it will not let you go. And what you can never know from the beginning is how hard or how long you'll love something. How even when it is gone, the love you felt will still chase you down, loping like dark flame through your blood." The wild dogs are real. They are out there, beyond the safety of the streets and houses, beyond the lights of the city, and one of those wild dogs is mine. So that's one of the most evocative metaphor creation passages that I've ever read, because is she talking about a literal wild dog, or is she talking about her love being out there beyond the lights of the city and the safety of the streets and the houses? Which one, or is it both? And so in the illness metaphor, in the illness story, we can create a metaphor for the illness, which sometimes really aids the process. And our language is full of metaphors. We talk about someone breaking your heart. We talk about someone stabbing you in the back. We talk about someone making you sick to your stomach. We talk about someone being a pain in the neck. And what's really interesting is that other cultures have different body metaphors, but they all have body metaphors for emotional experience. In Russian, you talk about several people filling your liver, which is one of the funniest metaphors I've ever heard. So every culture has its own body metaphors, but they all have those metaphors. And why does this matter? Because doctor-patient relationship and communication is the vehicle through which healing occurs, through which all the so-called placebo responding, which I think is more accurately called self-healing response, a term invented by Herbert Benson. That's how it happens, is through that relationship. And it doesn't take as much time as people say to build a good relationship. And it's worth it. So we're moving toward neuroscience. I'm not a very good time manager. But we'll get there. And I want to just mention the Lake Wobegon effect because it seems so important to me for us to be aware of. The term was invented by some epidemiologists at the University of Washington in Seattle. And they were looking at treatment recommendations that come out of randomized controlled trials. And the problem, and which is why we need individualized medicine, I think, the problem is that 20% of the patients control the variance in a randomized controlled trial. So the sickest people control the mean. And their point of view is that 80% of the patients get probably no benefit and have a lot of side effects from the treatment, whereas 20% of the patients, namely the sickest, get 80% of the benefit from the treatment. So, and the problem is that randomized controlled trials are so expensive that you can never afford to stratify. You just have to take whomever you can get. And that means that the sickest people can have the largest effect on the mean. And so we make recommendations based on 20% of the people for 100% of our patients. One of my favorite examples of that is the use of statins to prevent cardiovascular events. So the number needed to treat to prevent one cardiovascular event is around 230. And if you treat 230 people, 10 of them will get diabetes, and 35-ish will get problems with their muscles sufficiently severe that it prevents them from exercising. And so what are the effects of diabetes and being sedentary on health? Not that good. So it turns out that the number needed to harm is about the same as the number needed to treat, and in fact, a little bit less, and that, maybe we need to better individualize the treatment, because if you follow the computerized algorithm, every male over the age of 63 will be taking a high-intensity statin. And as one of my colleagues pointed out, the all-cause mortality didn't change as a result of taking statins. So what's that all about? So we're probably over-treating. And that's the point of the Lake Wobegon effect. And we need to think more clearly about people's stories and individualized medicine. So now for some neuroscience. So welcome to my favorite brain circuit, story brain. And I know some of you are neuroscientists, so you know all about story brain, but some of you are probably ignorant doctors like me, and you didn't hear of it beforehand. So story brain has a history. It was first recognized in the 1970s and 80s when people in Europe started doing MRI research. And in the early days of fMRI, you could publish almost anything. You could have somebody doing addition, and that was a paper. You could have someone doing subtraction, and that was a paper. You could have someone doing multiplication, and that was a paper. But you always needed a control group. And so what people did in the 70s and 80s was to tell the control group, well, don't do anything. Just sit there and don't do anything. Well, how many of you have tried to sit there and do nothing? Can't do it. Not possible. And so it was a researcher who said, when we tell the people to do nothing, they're doing something, because all of their scans are similar. But he didn't really do anything with it. And it wasn't until 2001 that Rakel and Guznard at Washington University in St. Louis did a systematic investigation of what people do when they do nothing. And they found out that it's very reliable and robust. And they called it the default mode network. And then they looked a little further and they said, well, you know what? When you tell people to do nothing, what they do is make up stories. They make up stories about the important people in their lives. And they run simulations about, people with whom they're in conflict, people with whom they want a favor, or, we might run a simulation about, how to better get along with our boss, or how to get some extra time off, or if we left home in an angry mood with our spouse, we might be running simulations of, what to do when we come home that evening, or what to pick up on the way home, flowers, chocolate, pizza, beer, nothing. We're doing all kinds of crazy stuff like that. And it's all about making up stories. And why do we make up stories? Because we need them for our social relationships. So default mode is story brain, is social brain. And it turns out that making up stories burns the least glucose of any activity that the brain does. And it uses the least oxygen. It's the most metabolically minimal activity that you can do. It truly is what the brain does on default. And so what are some of the important structures in default mode? Well, dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, ventral medial prefrontal cortex, posterior medial parietal cortex, posterior lateral parietal cortex. Oh, and don't forget the delicious temporal pole, which has to do with theory of mind, which is this idea that you're aware that other people have minds and not just you, which seems to be an important kind of awareness. So default mode engages most of the brain, whereas when you activate executive functioning mode, and focus on a demanding task, you have to turn off parts of the brain in order to focus. And that's what burns glucose. It takes more energy to turn off parts of the brain than to just let them run on idle and make up stories. So story brain understands stories. It's what is active when we're doing nothing. It's deactivated when we're engaged in goal-oriented activity. And you know what happens, like when you get to work, like when our residents get to work, they totally forget about their personal lives and they make checklists of all the things they have to check. Potassium in room 321 and sodium in room 396 and on and on and on. And it's a wonderful way to stop thinking about whatever problems you have at home, because you've deactivated story brain and you're just not thinking about it. So story brain manages our looking at ourselves, like looking inward and saying, who am I? Creating our identity narrative. And it manages thinking about who we are, unlike central executive network that produces action. So it's involved in theory of mind, moral reasoning, self-evaluation, memory, prospection, important things like that. Generates spontaneous thoughts when our minds are wandering, gets involved in creativity. It's engaged when we relate to other people, which we do through making up and telling stories. That's how we do it. So it turns out, and this is from the work of Dunbar, that there is a linear relationship between the size of your brain and the number of friends you can manage. So human beings can manage about 150 friends, and monkeys can manage about 25, and we can manage about 500 acquaintances, and monkeys are 100 plus. And so our Dunbar believes that our big brains evolved so that we can think about and manage our relationships with more others through story. And that's called the social brain hypothesis. So what are some problems with story brain? Well, if you're unfortunate enough to get labeled schizophrenic, it's hard for your brain to deactivate story brain, to turn it off and turn on central, functioning network. So, for instance, you might get lost in the label of a peanut butter jar at the grocery store and spend an hour, contemplating the meaning of each of the words on the label and never get to the checkout counter. So for people who are given the autism label, the activity of story brain is very low, which could explain deficits in social processing. So, and one of the really interesting therapies for autism that we heard presented by a woman from Warsaw, Poland, was to teach, she was teaching young men with autism how to make up good stories. And it actually generalized to their social relationships, and they became better able to function in the world. Now, Alzheimer's disease preferentially attacks story brain. And it's this buildup of beta amyloid in the default mode network or story brain that characterizes Alzheimer's disease. And what happens to people with Alzheimer's is they lose the capacity to tell stories and to understand stories. And without stories, we have no memory because we store memory in a narrative template. Trauma disrupts default mode. So trauma disrupts story brain. And one of the therapies for trauma is to find a way to embed the experience in a narrative template so that it can be talked about and processed. As we get older, it becomes harder to enter and leave story brain. And in fact, story brain comes online between the ages of 9 to 12. And if you go to a bookstore and look at children's books, you'll see this sudden explosion of sophistication that occurs in this 9 to 12 age group. So we go from, picture-dominant books with simple language and animal characters to more sophisticated books like the Babysitting Club and the Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, Harry Potter, Madeline Langla, The Swiftly Tilting Planet, things like that. So this surge in sophistication occurs around ages 9 to 12. So I'm just a little bit more neuroscience, and then I've had enough of that. But there's some specialization in the areas of the brain that compose default mode network. But as I know that you guys know now, there was a time when we thought in terms of what does each part of the brain do, and now we realize that what's more important are these networks. There's at least 15 networks, and that these networks can take over brain areas and put them to work in the service of the network, and that one brain region can belong to multiple networks. And of course, one good example of that is the anterior cingulate cortex, which is important in meditation. It's important in salience. It's important in threat detection and error detection. It does so much. Or the precuneus, for example. The precuneus assembles different sensory modalities for the use of various networks. So the precuneus is crucial to musicians because it turns out that musicians perform best when they have a multi-sensory story about the music that they're playing. Precuneus is important to default mode network because it makes our stories incredibly richer. You know, it's the difference between it was raining, a man walked down the street and saying it was a dark, gloomy, rainy night, and a man walked across the bridge shrouded in fog, wearing an overcoat, his collar around his ears. So that's the precuneus that brings in all that sensory information to implant in the stories that we're telling. Temporal pole and ventral medial prefrontal cortex are imagining. So what is this guy thinking who's walking across the bridge in the dark and the rain and the fog? You know, is he scared? Is he nervous? Is he planning something nefarious? You know, what is he mentalizing? And is he a spy? What is he? So, you know, we're using these parts of our brain to do all of these amazing things that we do when we make up a good story or tell a good story or listen to a good story. You know, and there's so much more to say about the neuroscience, but it can all be read. But, you know, one of the other interesting things about the anterior cingulate cortex, you know, it also operates in the circuitry that deals with pain. And it's in the anterior cingulate cortex that physical pain and emotional pain get integrated into a package that gets delivered to the frontal cortex. And it's in the anterior cingulate cortex that emotional pain and physical pain get all mixed up and confused, so that the frontal cortex can interpret emotional pain as physical pain and vice versa, because it's all integrated in the anterior cingulate cortex. All right, so just a little bit more about this narrative circuitry, which is predominantly medial midline circuitry in the brain. And of course, it connects to the amygdala, because what doesn't? And I don't know if any of you have read the work of Stephen Ledoux, who's at New York University, who studies the amygdala and looks at its amazing role in the fear, you know, fight, flight, freeze, panic response, and also happens to belong to an incredibly interesting rock band called the Amygdaloids, who play all around New York City. And if you Google the Amygdaloids, you can listen to Stephen Ledoux playing his guitar and singing about the amygdala, which is a uniquely wonderful experience, in my humble opinion. So the amygdala tells us whether we should be terrified by the story we're hearing, and also helps us to introduce terror into the story we're telling. I suspect Stephen King, who lives in our town, has a large amygdala, because he can sure tell some scary stories. But, and of course, it's the, you know, that connection of the frontal cortex to the amygdala that tells your amygdala to stand down. You know, that thing on the path, it's not a rattlesnake, it's just a stick. Take a deep breath and calm down. Relax. Today is not the day that you're going to get bitten by the rattlesnake. Actually, I learned living in Tucson that rattlesnakes are more scared of us than we are of them, poor things. So, one last little bit of neuroscience, and then we'll move on to clinical applications. So, one of the most fabulous discoveries was, in my mind, is the discovery of speaker-listener neural coupling. And it was published by Stevens, Silber, and Hassan in 2010. And their experiment was to put people in the fMRI telling a story about ordinary life, and then recording those stories, and then put people in the fMRI listening to those stories on a recording. And what they found was that the same areas of the brain light up in the listener as were activated in the teller of the story. And so that there really are auditory mirror neurons. And they surmise that this is the basis of empathy, is that if the same parts of my brain light up in me as are lit up in you, when you're telling me your story, then I'm so much better able to resonate with you, to have empathy with you and what happened to you, because I'm actually experiencing in my brain what you're experiencing. And so here are some of the fMRI photographs, depictions, images, and it's amazing. I mean, I just was blown away when I found this paper of speaker-listener neural coupling. The control group, by the way, consisted of people speaking Russian and telling a story in Russian in a really dramatic way to people who didn't speak Russian, and nothing happened. So you have to understand the story to experience speaker-listener neural coupling. One last thing, and I wanted to show you some fMRI images from a super duper Buddhist meditator who has really managed to turn off most of his brain. And what you see is just activation of the rostral anterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex during his meditation. Here's another view of that. That burns a lot of glucose. So there's so much more to talk about the brain, but I want to move on to clinical applications. And so I'm just going to go quickly through some things that you can look into in more depth at another time, which is the salience network is connected to story brain, because salience helps you to figure out what stories are the most important stories, what stories have the most meaning for you, what stories are the ones that really matter to you, and what stories you could care less about. And when your salience network gets wonky, when you have disconnectivity of the elements of the salience network, you can become labeled as psychotic, because you can't sort out what matters. Everything seems equally important, or some things seem incredibly more important than they actually are, and you can become paranoid, or what we call paranoid. So salience is an important network connected to default mode network. Okay, so So we're going to skip over the rest of this, which is so much fun. And we're going to go on to clinical applications. And somebody mentioned Gluescap was on a slide. Gluescap is from Maine. Gluescap, putting down the name of Gluescap was just a way to remind me to tell you some Gluescap stories, which I didn't have time to tell you. So you'll just have to come to Maine if you want to hear, or Nova Scotia, or New Brunswick, if you want to hear Gluescap stories. So my apologies. So I want to talk about some clinical applications now. And so people look at what happens in psychotherapy. So what happens in psychotherapy that is effective is one, helping people to retell their stories in a different way, with a different spin and a different perspective. And I saw this once with a friend of ours who actually fell for one of those Nigerian scams and sent money, wired money to someone who was pretending to be a friend of hers stranded in the London airport. And when she found out what she'd done, she was just beside herself. She just felt horrible. And it just really damaged her. And her, by nature, by occupation, she was a storyteller and a stand-up comic. And so we watched her work this story into a comedy routine. And by the time she finished, it was hilarious. And she had healed the trauma of being taken in by this scam. So that's how it works. Psychotherapy helps people to fill the gaps in the story to make it more believable, plausible, and meaningful. And it helps to put, as I mentioned earlier, traumatic experiences into a narrative scheme, a narrative template, so that they can be processed. In the psychotherapy of schizophrenia, which is something real, I've written some papers about, what we try and do is to help people tell coherent stories that can be readily understood by other people. So this is salience network retraining, and to create stories in which the character has more volition and more of a sense of agency and more of a sense of solidity of the self, because that's what's lacking in the stories that people who get that diagnosis tell. So I'm going to skip a little more. And so when people create meaning, make meaning through story, they have sudden gains in their mental health. And the way that we narrate our experiences has a profound effect on our mental health, above and beyond the impact of other variables. So the more we can make meaning out of the experiences of our lives, the more we experience well-being, social and emotional well-being. The more we process our negative life events and embed them in stories in which they have meaning, the more positive our mental health is. And if we stop this process of active meaning making, our mental health gets worse. And avoidance is the worst thing you can do. It works against clinical improvement. So to the extent that people can craft a coherent story, about their experiences, their well-being improves, as does their resilience and their mental health. So, creating stories of hope are associated with improved mental health. Stories of hopelessness, not so good. So we want to find ways to be hopeful and to build personal agency, which is the sense that when we do something in the world, it has an impact. So, so we're looking for, therapeutically now, we're looking for a story of what happened. This is the story of what went wrong. And secondly, we want a story of what's not wrong, a story of the person outside of the illness. And I often use the Northwestern University life story interview to get that story. And third, we want a story that travels into the future, that takes past experiences of loss, helplessness, embarrassment, anger, feelings of hopelessness, worthlessness, and transforms them into something positive. And finally, we want a plot. We want a strategy in which the character gets from the what's wrong story to the positive future story. And that involves creating a sense of agency, a sense of hopefulness, and sometimes skills to get from here to there. So we're going to skip some of this because I want to get to, well, I do want to mention this particular study because it came up earlier in my discussions with some people. So this is a really interesting study by a group in South Carolina who were looking at people with uncontrolled hypertension. And these were largely, this was largely a poor Black population. And so what they did was to find people who talked, acted, and looked like their target population to tell a story about how they controlled their uncontrollable hypertension. And they recorded those stories on DVDs, and they played them for the targeted population. And they didn't do anything else. That's all they did, was play these DVDs. It was 230 African Americans with hypertension in an inner city safety net clinic in South Carolina. 3 DVDs, and here's what they found. I'm going to show you the graph first. So systolic blood pressures dropped in the intervention group and went up or in the control group. Diastolic blood pressures dropped in the intervention group and actually went up in the control group. So, pretty cool. And they've duplicated this study now in rural Vietnam with the same principles of having people tell stories of how they got their blood pressure under control. And the people look, act, and sound like the target population. So here's another cool clinical application. It's a classic study that everybody quotes, so I'll quote it. Smith et al. From JAMA. And they had people with asthma or rheumatoid arthritis writing about stressful life experiences. And so they wanted to find out if writing about an emotionally traumatic experience would have a beneficial effect on symptoms, well-being, and healthcare use. So it was, basically their practice, and they had 61 people with asthma and 51 people with rheumatoid arthritis. And you probably wonder, how did they pick those conditions and why did they combine them? Well, one of the authors was a rheumatologist and the other one was a pulmonologist. So that's what they had. That was what was available to them. So they had people either write about either the most stressful event of their lives or, for the control group, an emotionally neutral topic. And the asthma patients were evaluated with spirometry, and the rheumatoid arthritis patients it was clinical exam. Baseline, 2 weeks, 2 months, 4 months after writing. And the evaluators didn't know what experimental condition the subject was in. So, combining all patients, 47% of the 70 experimental patients had clinically relevant improvement, whereas 9 or 24% of the 37 control patients had improvement. So it was a significant difference. Clearly they had a experimental to control ratio that wasn't 1-to-1, which is common in these sorts of studies. And here you can see some of the graphs. Black is control, gray is experimental, and you can see that the forced expiratory volume at 1 second, the percent of predicted, increased pretty dramatically among the asthma patients, and the overall disease activity decreased among the rheumatoid arthritis patients at 4 months follow-up. So now we're going to talk a little bit about mind mapping and getting into some of the, we're finishing off with some of the more fun parts of this. And mind mapping is making a map of what's in your mind. It's like that Capital One commercial. What's in your wallet? Well, this is what's in your mind. And so imagine for a moment that that you're reflecting upon a particular question. So you're holding a question in your mind. And for the medical students, when I do this exercise with my medical students, I try and pick something safe that's not too stressful. Like, usually for them it's, where am I going to do my residency and in what? Because I usually get third-year medical students, and somewhere toward the end of the third year, they got to decide because they have to apply for residency. And so I tell them, I'm like, okay, so who are the stakeholders in what you do and where you go? Inevitably, a romantic partner, when one exists, is a stakeholder. Parents, when they exist, and usually they do, are stakeholders. Friends are stakeholders. Occasionally, the Old Testament God is in there pitching for a particular place and specialty. Sometimes you get the Buddha making a guest cameo appearance. Sometimes Albert Schweitzer shows up. For me, it was Ben Casey and Dr. Kildare, if anyone is old enough to remember those characters. So a mind map consists of a drawing of all of the stakeholders who have an interest in where you go for residency and what will become your specialty. And those of you who are graduate students, you probably went through a similar process deciding where to go to graduate school and what field to enter. And so what we do is make drawings. This is one example of a drawing of all of the characters and what they're saying. And this is a drawing of what they're saying and rather than the characters themselves. It's a drawing of the messages coming from each of the stakeholders. And you might imagine that in contemplating where to go for residency, that your parents are saying, stay close to home, find something close to home. And your sister's saying, go somewhere exotic where I want to visit, where it'll be really fun to come see you, like San Francisco or New Orleans. Albert Schweitzer might be saying, you should enter a specialty where you can be of most service to the people. For me, Ben Casey was arguing with me that I should have been a neurosurgeon. I eventually put a muzzle on him and shut him up. But it was some work, I had to do 3 months of a neurosurgery rotation as a medical student before I finally got, some masking tape over Ben Casey's mouth and got him to shut up about going into neurosurgery. So this is mind mapping, is getting to know the characters in your mind and what they're saying, what stories they're telling you. And it's inspired by both indigenous practice and also Mikhail Bakhtin, a Russian philosopher who talked about the mind as a polyphonous cacophony of disparate, independent, feuding, arguing, cantankerous voices, none of whom can agree with each other. That was Bakhtin's definition of the mind. And it certainly fits my experience some days. You can get them under control sometimes with mindfulness meditation, but it's work. And so in this exercise, what we do is write the dialogue of all these characters and get them talking. And as we do that, it becomes more clear who's advocating for what, and it becomes a more rational process of whom do you want to listen to, and what do you want to believe of all these stakeholders in your future. So that's mind mapping, and it's really fun. It's also voice mapping, and it's how we work with people who hear voices. So it's empowering to gain mastery over the voices. So in our work with people who hear voices, we don't try and eliminate the voices. We work with the people to negotiate better terms for getting along with the voices. And so, and if that's hard, we turn to the origin of the idea promoted by the voice. So how did you learn that you don't deserve the air that you breathe? Or who in the world in your past talked like that? What that mean voice say remind you of anyone in your past? You know, who could that have been? We try and look at the volume of the voices, and from the map, we identify the soft voices, the loud voices, and the therapy consists of helping the soft, positive voices to get a bit louder and helping the person to form coalitions of positive voices to stand up to the negative voices. And this can take all kinds of forms. So we can play with, getting an image for the voice. Because as you know from Harry Potter, I forget which Harry Potter movie it was, but if you take your worst fear or nightmare and put it in a hilarious costume, it loses its power. It was one of the classes in the Defense Against the Dark Arts that Harry Potter had to take. And so we try to get people to give shape to their voice. And what are they wearing? What kind of perfume do they like? Do they have a form, or are they nebulous? Do they have concrete characteristics, or are they vague or vaporous? Where do they live? How do they decorate their apartment? What does their place look like? What's their theme song? What's the lighting? What kind of movies do they like to watch? It can really get to be really fun. And what happens when they interact? Sometimes we do that, as I mentioned, with writing dialogue. Sometimes in the pre-COVID days, when we had groups, everybody grabbed a puppet and played a voice. And sometimes people put on masks. People make masks for the various voices and perform them in that way. So the final thing that I want to mention is, how do you build agency? How do you cultivate self-agency? And it often involves teaching people to think about their lives in the template of the hero's journey. So the hero's journey structure is a structure in which people gain a sense of self-agency. And it's been used in all kinds of ways, from fundraising to psychotherapy. And it's this idea that that I'm the hero of my story, and I have a goal. And there are obstacles to that goal. And the first strategy that I implement to surmount the obstacles and achieve the goal probably won't work. There will be dark nights of the soul. I will have to persevere and come up with more than one strategy. How will I do that? So what are some examples? Well, Luke Skywalker, one of my favorites, once upon a time, reluctantly he found a droid holding crucial information that could save the galaxy. And he embarked on a heroic journey to get that information to where it needed to go. once upon a time, Dorothy found herself in a tornado that carried her to Oz. And she met some strange dudes and went on a journey, to get back home again. Once upon a time, Frodo Baggins' uncle gave him a ring that could destroy Middle-earth. And he had to reluctantly go on a journey to get rid of the ring in Mount Doom. So these are heroic stories, and they've even been used as projective tools by drama therapists, by Lahad and Ayalon. And anyway, it's really fun way to work with people. And I'm coming to the end of my prepared remarks, such as they were. And now I think it's time for us to interact. So I'm going to stop sharing and look at you guys again. All right, and pull out the chat room. I hope you enjoyed the entertainment for the evening.
So Linda, Kate, I'm just going to open for questions. Are we taking questions now?
Sure. If there's people who would like to ask, they can do the hand raising. Hopefully we can identify.
Yeah, Catherine, you can unmute and ask your question.
Oh, Emmanuel too.
Yeah, they switched. It's Catherine.
May I start?
Yes, go ahead.
Start my
Go ahead,
camera
Emmanuel.
because I apologize. I cannot start my camera because it has been shut down. Thank you for your talk. I am a social neuroscientist and I am very favorable and fond of the idea of brain couplings. I hope that my accent is not too difficult for you. There's a complementary aspect of narrative where the recipient of brain-to-brain coupling is not the patient, but is the doctor. And this relates to my long life observation of, for instance, general practitioners use a lot of memory to contextualize their patients. And a single anecdote often is used by them as a trigger for a long history of what the patient is about. So there's kind of repetitive, reiterative entanglement between the two brains and the two history of the patient and the doctor. And it is my belief that the very best GPs use the anecdote and the narrative to warm up and to refresh their access to the memory of the patient history. And so I was wondering whether you were thinking and interested in these aspects of coupling where, in a sense, the patient serves as a stimulus and trigger narrative context into the doctor rather than the other way around.
Indeed, I think that's a really
Susan
important.
Schneider wants to know how she raises her hand, I believe.
It's a really important area because I keep trying to convince my residents that they're a therapeutic instrument, that their simple presence in a non-judgmental and non-interpretive way is therapeutic for their patients. And that even though they don't think they're doing anything, they're doing quite a lot. And that simply seeing somebody frequently helps them get better. And we did a study which I'm looking for a journal to submit to, in which we used medical students to get life stories from patients and then gave them to the primary care physician to read, and then monitored the doctor-patient relationship over a year, as well as the patient's level of pain anxiety, depression, and quality of life. And we found that without her doing anything else than getting a life story and giving it to the doctor to read, that of course the doctor-patient relationship improved, and the improved doctor-patient relationship was associated in reductions in chronic pain, improvement in depressive symptoms, and improvement in quality of life, though it didn't change anxiety. But then everybody worries. So yeah, that was that. I thought, wow, this was a simple intervention that didn't cost anything because we did it with medical students, and changed pain. And so far I've sent the paper to 2 pain journals, and they rejected it, both of them saying that it wasn't relevant to the practice of pain management because it was so impractical. And we thought, well, you could have your medical assistant get a life story. You could train her to get a life story, and you could probably bill for it even. If you went in and shook the patient's hand. It's I don't know if that is so impractical. I mean, we did it our way in a residency training setting because we had captive medical students that we could order around. But actually the medical students, every single medical student said that it was an incredibly positive experience. And it helped them understand, more about these patients. And the medical student who fought hardest not to do it, who was planning a career in ophthalmology, where she didn't have to talk to patients, she could just look in their eyes. Even she begrudgingly admitted that it was a really good experience. He said, "How was that?" She said, "Well, it was actually okay. It wasn't as bad as I thought. It was even almost fun."
So we have one more, Susan Schneider, I think.
Hi, thank you. That was really enjoyable. So while listening to your talk, I had been reading over the summer Daniel Kahneman's wonderful book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And I can't help but ask how the default network might relate, because I don't think it's a characteristic example of either system. And of course, dual systems theories are very contentious and whatnot, but I was just curious if you had any thoughts on that issue.
I haven't read that book yet. It's on my list. I haven't gotten that far down yet, which is no reflection on the author, of course. I don't know how to answer that question. And I think about people who say they think too fast. And, in clinical practice, we give them anticonvulsants to slow down their thinking. And I don't know, I don't know which circuits were impacting entirely. And I suspect story brain is involved, but I think some other circuitry is involved too in slowing people down, so they can think slower. And I've not, in clinical practice, no one's ever come to me and said, "I think too slowly," which is interesting.
I'm sorry, I should have clarified. I should have elaborated a little bit on what I was thinking, because I don't think anticonvulsants are needed. Okay, it's just, in the normal case, normally, when the brain is in a highly deliberative frame of mind, consider like taking a GRE exam, it's very slow, sequential, and whatnot, and that's system 2. And then system 1 is like the more automatic, rapid fire processing the brain engages in. And I guess what I was interested in, like, quick shot categorization, for example, is how the default network interacts, or if you thought it might be characterizable in either of those ways.
Yeah, it fits into, there's a French neuroscientist who invented a term called neurophenomenology. And he talks about our capacity to instantaneously recognize micro situations and respond. And that it has to do with having very well rehearsed, almost implicit stories about how things work and what needs to be done, so much so that we assign something to a template virtually automatically and respond virtually automatically. And it's only when we don't get the expected results that we step back and engage another brain system and say, what? Why isn't this working? Which is error detection network, which says, wait a minute, I better reflect upon this. I'm not getting the desired or expected response. What's wrong with my model? What's wrong with the stories I have about this person or situation? And how do I refit? What story is missing? And maybe that comes close to what you're talking about, because he talks about these two, he calls them ethical modes, or perceptual modes, sort of modes of embodied perception, where one is instantaneous and automatic, and the other is slow and analytic and thoughtful and reflective.
We have a question earlier that someone needed to ask that their microphone isn't working so they can ask it. So I'm going to read the question from Candace. The concept of mind mapping seems very interesting. I know that at school we were taught to use it as a study tool, but I never thought of using it in a clinical setting. Could this process be applied to other anxiety and mood disorders to process through all the different thoughts and fears that make everything seem overwhelming?
We use it that way, indeed. And so the process is one of taking each thought and linking it to a character. Like, where did that thought come from? Who first said that? And sort of reverse engineering, taking the thoughts and tracing them backwards to where they originated. And yes, it can be a really effective way of working with anxiety. And it can sort of be, it makes me think of someone whom I'm working with right now, who's afraid to leave her house, and we've been playfully imagining all of the characters in her mind who might be lurking outdoors, under the mailbox or behind the stop sign, including, Marty the Martian with his ray gun, who's going to zap her into non-existence, and, Wile E. Coyote with an anvil, he's going to drop on her head, and all the people who hated her in high school who are going to, make fun of her as she walks to the grocery store. And luckily, and then we look at, so what are the probability that Marty Martian is actually under the mailbox? And, what is the probability that your high school classmates from Idaho are here in Bangor, Maine, waiting to make fun of you when you step out of your house? I mean, absolutely possible. I'll give you that. But how about the actual probability here. So
I think we have two more questions. I don't know how many we can take, Linda. I think two people have hands up.
Yeah, think we have three up. Let's start with Vijaya.
Vijaya?
Vijaya?
One second, let me see. Yeah, I'm unmuted. So my question is, you have talked about different communications like the storytelling, things like that, that affects the overall health downstream. Does that have to do with the brain-immune interactions as well?
Everything is about the brain, right? I mean, where would we be without a brain? I guess, was it the scarecrow who sang "If I Only Had a Brain"?
Yeah.
Yeah. So somehow even the scarecrow had computational abilities somewhere. So yes, I mean, I think that storytelling, I think the stories are the units that our brain uses to function. So brain functions in stories. So you could think about stories as the smallest units or patterns that get processed through circuits. And so these patterns have concomitant or associated immune responses, hormonal responses, smooth and skeletal muscle responses, stories. You've all experienced how stories can change the heart rate. That's why I don't watch horror movies, because I don't actually enjoy my heart rate going up that fast. But, we know that stories affect our physiology. And so, yes. And I think that when we change stories, we change these patterns that run through our brain, and then we change the physiology. We change the hormones and the immune molecules that are being pumped out. And probably some of you who do neuroscience for a living can explain that better than I can. But, clinically, I see people change. And they look different, they act different, they feel different. And so therefore I conclude that their brain is different. And I think that's supported by the fMRI.
I think we have a question now from Dr. Anastasio.
Hi. A two-part question. In the slide deck, I saw something about meditation, and you showed how the mind went almost blank, except for a little bit of a small area of activity. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how you use meditation, either in your therapy or overall. And secondly, all of your slides were wonderful and so much detail, and certainly we had to skip over a lot. I was wondering if there's any way we can get a copy, or you can share or email your slide deck so that we can review it in more depth at a later date.
I have the presentation that I can share with all of you.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
And I have your emails that you joined, and I will send them all to you and share. He shared it with me earlier. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I already forgot the first part of your question.
Mindfulness, the role of mindfulness.
Yes. So I think it's really therapeutic to stop thinking occasionally, to just turn the whole thing off, and to be silent. It's work. I mean, it takes an effort to stop thinking. We have to practice it. But certainly I think it's desirable. And it's definitely supported by research that, mindfulness is health promoting. I think it's funny that they call it mindfulness. I think of it as mindlessness, to be able to just stop thinking for a while is kind of good. to let all the networks take a rest.
I think we have one final question from Krista, if you want to unmute.
Linda, there's also Lisa.
Is there somebody else? Okay, I'll scroll down.
Yeah.
Hello. So my question had to do with the default mode network. I'm really, really interested in that from all kinds of standpoints. I'm studying neuro right now, and I would love to do some research with that in the future. But my question was related to your knowledge and or experience in how the DMN and how its functions, specifically within the under the name of narrative medicine, are being received by pharmacological companies or even manufacturers, or just the pharmaceutical industry at large, just because there's this glaring problem with certain mental illnesses that is not quite solved by things like SSRIs, SNRIs. Those are very contentious right now, and I believe that they have been for a little while. So I was wondering if you had experience or knowledge of research being done in that field that might obviate these problems without the use of SSRIs or something like that.
Well, so I would say that those of us that are into these things are underfunded. And it's hard, it's harder to fit into the reductionist paradigm and to get funding than it is when you're studying drugs. Drug studies are much easier to fit into a reductionist, double-blind, randomized control trial paradigm than narrative therapy. I don't see the pharmaceutical industry being very threatened by us in the near future. That I'd like to believe that the world is changing and that non-pharmacological means of affecting emotional and social well-being are growing in prominence and use. Because I agree with you, in clinical practice, it's rare that the drugs work, for what people want. I mean, sure, occasionally you hit a home run and you give someone a medication and they're like, wow, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread and I just feel great. That is the exception. And mostly people just come back and back and back, and they're on this obsessive search for the right medicine that'll make them feel nothing or else feel only happiness. Because I fear that we've pathologized sadness and, worry, like it's probably okay to have some sadness and worry. It probably is surviving, survival benefit. So, if the medications worked in the way they were advertised, we wouldn't need any more psychiatric beds. I mean, it's just, sadly, it's just not the case. And, we struggle with that every day. People keep insisting that if only they were on the right meds, and why should they have to change their lives? And why should they have to do psychotherapy? And in my practice, the right meds are always benzodiazepines, stimulants, or opiates. That's what people want. I'm like, no, can't give you that. Doesn't work that way. No can do. Medical board doesn't like it. Not in Maine. Go to Florida. Maybe you can get it there.
I
Thank you for that.
I think there's one more. Do you see Linda, or did the person leave? I'm not sure. It says from a nursing perspective, how to gather the story focusing on the past, present, and future, and apply story theory in a therapeutic manner. How do you do that? How do you gather the story focus on the past, present, and future, and apply story theory in a therapeutic manner?
Hi, I'm going to jump in there. Lisa Weesey. And hi again, Dr. Mehl-Madrona. I'm so thrilled to have you with us today. It was just a comment I was making is that we had a faculty who just retired, Dr. Patricia Lear. She and her colleague, Dr. Mary Jane Smith, developed an approach to gathering the story from the patient. It's called story theory. It's been around for over 20 years. It's well published and documented. They've done a lot of work in a lot of different publications. So I just wanted to bring your attention to that. And I put the link to their blog spot, which has everything about the theory in a very easy to...
No, that's wonderful. And in fact, it shows how we live in our silos and we don't know what people are doing in their silos. So I had no idea that story theory existed in nursing. So now I'm going to have to look that up. And
great.
Maybe I'll send my paper to a nursing journal. Maybe that's the only place I can get it published.
We have some really great nursing journals that...
Oh, I believe you. And for obstetrics, I rely on the midwifery journals better than the OB journals. The studies are much better. So I'm going to have to look at more nursing journals.
Great.
Open my eyes.
Yay.
So is there any more, Linda, or are we at the end?
I do not see any more questions.
We can all turn our microphones on and give
Yes.
a round of applause for our speaker.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Dr. Mehl-Madrona.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It was a fun day. It would have been more fun if I would have been with you guys in person, but it was still really fun.